Good evening. I am Hope Preston, and this is the June chapter meeting for the Washington County Master Gardener Association. We don't meet in July and August, so our next presentation and meeting will be September 3rd, and the topic of that one will be Getting Wild, 7 Steps to Increasing Biodiversity in Your Yard. But this evening, we are hearing from Logan Bennett, who's coming to us from Douglas County, where he is the Small Farms Coordinator for OSU Extension. Oh, Logan, I have to tell you, I am mesmerized by this flying bee. I don't know how you achieved it, but I could watch it all evening, but I know that you've got a presentation to do. So I guess I won't watch it all evening.
It's all good.
For everybody listening, we will do put your questions if questions come up, put them in the Q&A, and at the end of Logan's presentation, I will sort through them and read them off to Logan, and he can address them then. And also keep your eye on the chat, where there's a few links that we will be posting that are relevant to the presentation. So Logan, tell us all about integrated pest management.
Sounds good, Hope. Well, howdy, folks. My name is Logan Bennett. I'm the Small Farms Program, Horticulture, and Master Gardener Coordinator here in Douglas County. So I'm coming to you live from Roseburg today. Before we get started on integrated pest management, I just wanted to put out a disclaimer. I will be talking about pesticides today. There'll be some examples of pesticides today, but the OSU Extension Service does not endorse or recommend any specific product listed in my program today. The product names and different pesticides I'm showing are just examples that you may come across in a home or garden store. And the information in this presentation shouldn't be regarded as a substitute for a professional consultation. So if you ever need a specific pesticide recommendation, feel free to reach out to me or your local coordinator, whoever you work with in the Extension Service. All right. So with that out of the way, what are we talking about today? Well, the title of this presentation is IPM, Integrated Pest Management, but what does that boil down to? So we're going to be looking at making informed decisions when it comes to agriculture, and that means in your home garden all the way up to a commercial scale farm. We want to make sure that we're making the right decisions to treat for the problems that we have. And that includes learning about monitoring for pests, what those life stages look like, diagnosing those issues, and both pests and disease, and then choosing the management strategies that align with both your goals and your ethics. And that's your financial goals, your economic goals, or the goals of what you want your home garden or farm to look like. So before we really dig into it, let's talk about the history of pest management. Well, the first thing that most people wonder when I talk about this is, why should I care about pesticides? Well, sometimes they may be the best choice or the only choice you have for a specific issue. Oftentimes, pesticides can be used to avoid worse problems. And also, they can just be part of a toolkit, so you can use them to make informed management decisions. And then, of course, knowing how to handle and dispose of pesticides if you end up using them increases both the efficacy of that pesticide, decreases the mystery around pesticides, and increases your personal safety. So we want to just be aware of what we're doing or why we're doing it when we do it. Okay, so what is a pesticide? I'm using that word a lot tonight. Well, we'll start with the EPA definition, which is any substance or mixture of substances intended to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate any kind of pest, or any substance or mixture of substances intended for use as a plant regulator, so to make it grow faster, make it grow slower, defoliant, or desiccant. So this is the sort of the textbook definition. But let's put that into perspective. So the United States, 74 to 90% of households utilize pesticides on an annual basis. So 74 to 90% of us are using pesticides annually. Normally, this is where I ask folks if they use Clorox clean wipes at home. But since I don't have a live audience today, I'm going to assume that some of you said, oh yeah, I do. That's actually considered a pesticide. If you look at the bottle that those come in, they have a label on the back that shows the active ingredient and instructions on how to use them, right? Here in Oregon, 46% of households used pesticides in 2007. That's from a report in 2008. There's not a newer version of that report, so that's the data we have to use. And in the Portland metro area, 29% of households used lawn and garden pesticides, and 17% used indoor pesticides. So, do we understand pesticides as Oregonians? It's generally underreported, and the risk perception is generally underestimated. So, one of the reasons that pesticide use is generally unreported is because A, folks don't always know what they're using is a pesticide. And B, sometimes talking about pesticide use can be viewed in a negative light or as almost embarrassing, which it shouldn't be. But because of that sort of stigma around it, folks tend to not talk about it. In a survey done by the Oregon Pesticide Use Reporting System, participants were unable to determine what were pesticides, and the continued concerns about ability of pesticide users to read the label and correctly identify information came up a lot. So that's not to say that folks don't know how to read or anything like that. It's just that pesticide labels can be very complicated. And so understanding that literature when you go into it and before you use it's really important. If you haven't read a pesticide label before, or you need to brush up on reading pesticide labels, OSU actually has a document for that. And it's a good one. I know that because I wrote it. You should check that out. Another quote here. Moss control pesticide or products accounted for 47% of the pounds of active ingredient. So 47% of the usage was for moss control, but only 2% of the reports showed moss control as the purpose of that application. And what that's telling us is that there was a lot of applications of pesticides that were off-label. They weren't being used for what they were designed for. And so A, they're not as effective, and B, if they're used in the wrong area or the wrong system, they can become dangerous. So we really want to make sure that we know what we're doing when we use pesticides. Okay, so these are the two biggest misconceptions I see, both ends of the spectrum. I work with folks who think that pesticides may be the only answer or the silver bullet per se. This is what we're going to do. We're going to spray something, we're going to solve it. And on the other hand, I also work with folks who absolutely refuse to use pesticides because they're all super bad for the environment and that kind of thing. And both of those ideologies are incorrect, right? There is no silver bullet when it comes to pest management, and pesticides can be a really useful part of a toolkit. And especially when used correctly, some of them are relatively low risk. So we want to meet somewhere in the middle here when we're talking about the use of pesticides and what we can do around those, our other options. So what is a pest, right? Normally when I say pest, a lot of folks think of insects. And of course you do, because there are a lot of insect pests, especially when we're talking about agriculture and agronomy specifically. But it can also be mice, deer, and other animals, unwanted plants like weeds, microorganisms like fungi, bacteria, and viruses. Pests are just organisms living out of place. If you're coastal, you might be familiar with this one. This is a double-crested cormorant. A lot of folks view them as a pest here. They're non-native in Oregon, and they're pretty widespread in the coastal areas of the state. So here's an example of something we would call a pest. This is pigweed or amaranth. It's highly invasive in agricultural systems. The family itself is known to take over entire fields, and oftentimes we're using elaborate mixes of chemicals to spray it out. So you'll see here, I've got some Penn State recommendations. These aren't for Oregon, but these are some of the herbicides used to take out amaranth. So 2,4-D, dicamba, atrazine, simazine, some heavy hitting stuff in there, right? But on the other hand, if you go to a store that sells Bob's Red Mill products, you might find amaranth on the shelf because a lot of species or some species of it are actually edible and prized in some places. And I have written here $9 to $10 a pound. I made this slide 2 or 3 years ago, so it's probably more than that now. And also, amaranth is a traditional food source in some places. So what I'm trying to showcase here is that while we view a lot of the amaranth family as pests, in some systems, they're not considered a pest. In fact, they're a prized edible. So a pest is an organism living out of place. Okay, let's jump into the history really quickly on pesticides, and then we're going to go back towards IPM. So the etymology of the word pesticides. Insecticide was the first sort of use we used, with Paris green as a pesticide. It was an insecticide labeled in 1865. We don't use Paris green anymore. It's got some pretty gnarly stuff in it. In 1888, they came out with the word herbicide. And then in 1889 with the Bordeaux mixture. That's actually still used today in some systems. And then in 1939, we came up with the word pesticide, encompassing all three of these. So a pesticide can be a fungicide, an herbicide, or an insecticide. Any of you are from the Rogue Valley, you may have heard of this before. This is from the Rogue Valley Golf Course in 1911. These are the names of the holes that were golfed back then. And if you'll notice, they're all named after pear pests. Okay, woolly aphid, thrips, anthracnose, blight. These were really important topics to the large farming communities down in the Rogue Valley. And so it just seemed relevant to name them after the pests that they are constantly fighting. This is an advertisement from Bassett's Drug Store, same time of the year, 1911. And what it's showing here is that it's almost time to spray your lime sulfur solution and your arsenate of lead. And the reason I'm showing this is because pesticide usage used to be on a schedule. We didn't monitor for thresholds or look for specific issues. When it was time to spray, you sprayed. And that would help with certain things, the diseases we were targeting, but not so much with the after effects or the side effects of spraying. Okay, here's a classic example of that. If any of you are growing one of the 50 crops I'm about to show at home, you've probably dealt with this specific species. This is the two-spotted spider mite. We have a picture of a larva, an adult egg, and some of the morphs here. They're really characteristic for those two spots on the side of the pest, and they're almost clear. Very hard to see without a hand loop. They're really small. So in Oregon, they're an issue in over 50 crops, main ones being mint, hops, grapes, hazelnuts. If you're growing any of those at home, you've probably seen these before. Same with strawberries, caneberries, that's blackberries, raspberries, things like that. They're really prevalent in, and they can cause a lot of issues. I used to work in hops a lot as an agronomist. One thing spider mites will do is turn the hop cones yellow, and people don't want to buy yellow hop cones. So it's really important, especially on a commercial scale, to monitor for this particular pest when you're doing your agricultural work. So one thing we learned over the course of many years is that when you spray for a specific pest, let's say two-spotted spider mite in this case, you're actually also affecting a lot of your natural biological controls, especially if you're using something that's broad spectrum, right? So if you spray for two-spotted spider mite, you open up a niche, and then all of a sudden you've got leaf miners, leaf hoppers, European red mites, or Parassilla. So choosing when to spray and what you're spraying will really affect the outcome short-term and long-term. All right, next let's talk about synthetic insecticides. Broad-spectrum neurotoxins, right? So organochlorines, DDT, chlordane, organophosphates, parathion and clopyrifos, carbamides, carbaryl, aldicarb, and pyrethroids, permethrin and deltamethrin. You've probably seen some of these before if you've gone into your local co-op or an agricultural store, right? Carbaryl, permethrin are really common nowadays. You'll notice I have a few of these highlighted too, DDT, chloridane, and clopyrifos, right? And the reason I have those highlighted is because those are the ones that over time have been either banned or banned in certain applications. So most of us are familiar with DDT. That got banned in 1972. They realized it was having large environmental impacts and health impacts on people. Chlordane got banned in 1988 for similar reasons. And then clopyrifos, Lohr's ban is the one I have up here, but that's just an example. Recently got banned for food crops in 2021. And the reason for that is these aren't just coming out and then being put on the shelf and forgot about. The USDA is constantly testing these and monitoring what happens when these products are applied to see the effects. And if they realize that something is too dangerous, oftentimes they get banned in applications that will make them dangerous. So that's what we saw happen with Lohr's ban or clopyrifos recently. This is another graph just to show the difference in what's happening in terms of agricultural use in pesticides over time, right? So this is to say that growers don't necessarily want to use broad spectrum neurotoxins, right? They're choosing to use what's most effective and best for the crop production where they can. So one thing that we've seen recently is the introduction of codling moth mating disruption. You may have seen these at the garden store. You may even have them at home. They're called puffers, usually. And what they are is a pheromone that gets emitted from a machine that shows that all of the female codling moths in a certain orchard are already gravid, already pregnant. And so what happens is that deters male codling moth from coming to those orchards. It actually reduces the incidence of that particular pest, right? So this is a graph showing organophosphate use in blue from 1991 up to 2007, right? And you'll see a marked decrease right around 2001 in organophosphate use. And the reason for that is because codling moth mating disruption treatment got better and more readily available, right? So when folks realized that they could purchase this and it would work as well or better, depending on the situation, and for less cost sometimes, the usage of that went up quite a bit, and the usage of organophosphates, dropped quite a bit. Okay, so we just went over a little bit of the basics of the history of pesticides, and we'll kind of round it out with this. So there's kind of three eras of the insecticidal age. The pre-synthetic era was 1865 to 1945. That includes inorganic compounds, so Paris green, lead arsenate, sulfur, soaps, oils, and botanicals. Some of those are still used today, largely sulfur, especially in vineyard situations. The broad spectrum era, which is 1945 to current. So that includes organochlorines, organophosphates, carbamides, pyrethroids, and neonics. And then the selective era, which is current and the future, includes new chemistries. So selective neurotoxins, metabolic poisons, insect growth rate regulators, microbials, GMOs, and behavioral methods. So these are really designed to target specific genera of insects or like specific species of insects. And they have a really good action on that one particular thing. The reason that we haven't fully adopted these now is A, they're not as readily available, and B, they can be very expensive. So some of the pesticides that we'll talk about a little bit later work really well, but they're cost prohibitive on a large scale and oftentimes on a small scale too. But as these move forward and as we have more research on the subject and more of these kinds of pesticides become more readily available, we'll move from broad spectrum into selective. Okay, now that we have some background, let's talk about IPM. So what is integrated pest management? Integrated pest management aims to reduce crop losses from pests that are effective, economically viable, and ecologically compatible. IPM is a strategy to prevent and suppress pests with minimum impact on human health, the environment, and non-target organisms. So our goal here is to create a system that reduces our pest load while maintaining some kind of ecologic, effective, and economic viability in our farm or our home garden. All right, let's talk about the ABCs of IPM because I like alphabet soup. ABCs. A, we always want to be monitoring. So in our home garden, we want to be checking daily if we can. Look through the garden, scout it, see if you're seeing the beginnings of pests or diseases. B, we want to be confident when we're identifying an issue. We want to be able to identify that pest or that disease. And that brings us to C. Once we have found it, we know what it is, then we can choose an appropriate control for that. And we can learn when to use cultural, physical, biological, and chemical controls, and in that order too. Okay, so starting with A, when we're in the garden, we want to be scouting. We're looking for those issues. Are we seeing evidence of bugs? Are we seeing evidence of diseases starting or progressing? What kind of weed profile do we have growing throughout the garden? What do we need to be doing about that? That's where we start seeing these and diagnosing them early. And then once we know the issues we have, we can apply a control at the optimal time, whether that means weeding, flaming, or using some kind of chemical option. Outside the garden, OSU Extension has a really great garden calendar. Some of you may be subscribed to that. Rich sends out an email, I think every month, and it shows you the idea of what you should be doing in your garden this time of year. If you find an issue, diagnosing that using the P&W handbook or our new tool, Solve Pest Problems, or social media can be really helpful for that too. The P&W disease management page on Facebook is run by Jay Scheit, and it's actually super helpful. He posts problems on that website or on that Facebook page, and then he leaves it open. You get to go through and look through the comments and kind of help everyone else determine what the issue is. And then also degree day monitors. So if you're unfamiliar with the idea of a degree day monitor, what this does is shows the heat accumulation over time through a year and gives you an idea of when pests might be born or what stage they might be going through. And it gives you an idea of an optimal time to treat for them. So US Pest gives a great degree day monitor for a lot of species in Oregon. It's really worth checking out. Okay, so monitoring. We want to be looking for pests, and we want to be looking for their damage. In this case here, I have a picture of aphids affecting a tree on the screen. Notice all that leaf curl there. That's pretty severe, but it gives us an idea of, okay, something's going on here. I better turn these leaves over and check out what's happening. Another thing to be doing is looking for beneficial organisms. I was on a farm 3 or 4 days ago, and we saw a bunch of poison hemlock, which is concerning. But if you looked closer, you could actually see that some of those plants were completely defoliated. So while there is an issue there, there's already a biological control going through and stripping that poison hemlock of all of its foliage. So I'll leave you that question. Is it something you need to treat now, or is it something that you should let that biological control take care of? And then I know this might sound silly, but it's definitely worth keeping a garden journal. So I do it at home too. It's worth writing down the day, what you've seen, what the weather was like. Is there any progression of specific issues? Are you noticing something odd? Is your broccoli turning a weird color? Did you develop a borehole in a particular tree? That kind of thing. And then if you get to the point where you need to treat a problem, you can look back into that journal and say, wow, okay, I've been monitoring this for 2 weeks. This is the progression of the issue. Okay, so what kind of monitoring can you do? Visual monitoring, we've talked about that quite a bit. What pests am I seeing and how many? And that's a good point to bring up too. Just because you see one coddling moth doesn't necessarily mean you need to be spraying for them. You can also use things like color traps, so sticky cards and water bowls. Pictured here is a sticky card that's actually for coddling moth. And as you can see there, there's a lot of moths. So in that case, we probably want to be treating. And then there's also shelter, food, and mate traps. So beer and bread traps and pheromone traps. The picture here below of that insect, that's EAB, emerald ash borer. That one specifically is best for visual monitoring, actually. The color traps and the pheromone traps that we have for EAB aren't as effective as going out and actually looking for flight patterns. Okay, another thing we can be doing with visual monitoring is actually looking for symptoms on a plant. So the picture here on the left is feeding from a black vine weevil that's on rhododendron. And you can see that kind of, it almost looks like it's been scissored out in a really odd fashion, right? So that's really indicative of weevil damage. So if we see that in our gardens, we might say, okay, I'm pretty sure I have a weevil issue here. And then on the right, this is wine grapes. I see this every year, many times a year. Those blisters that we're seeing on that leaf are really indicative of uranium mites. So if you flip that leaf over, it'll actually be white, or if it's a really bad case, it'll actually be purple. And that gives you an idea of how many mites or mite populations you might be dealing with. Okay, talking about color traps. So these are typically best for small flying insects and arthropods, so aphids, thrips, whiteflies. Sometimes they can work for spider mites. Typically what you have is a color trap like this, and then on one side or the other, there will be a pheromone attached to that. So the insect is attracted to that pheromone, gets stuck on the trap, and then you come out and count how many of whatever target pest you're looking for, and then you can determine whether or not you need to spray from that. There's also pheromone traps. These are used really commonly in commercial operations. The one on the left, that apple-shaped pheromone trap, that is for apple maggots, and then the one on the right is for codling moth. So there's two pests that we're really looking for in apple production, and they have two different kinds of pheromone traps. And that's not to say that these are the only traps available for either species. These are just commonly seen ones. Another thing we can do are bait and manual traps, right? Who's used a slug beer trap at home? Probably a lot of us. As it turns out that bread dough, so a mixture or a slurry of yeast and water, is actually more effective at catching slugs than beer is. So, little note for you there. We can also just use manual traps like a board on the ground, can actually be pretty effective in catching snails and slugs. And then there's more commercial traps here, shown with this green plastic trap. Once they get in, it's very hard for them to get out. And that brings me to the next topic. Do you need to buy a commercial trap? Sometimes they're super helpful, right? This trap on the right, the Farrakhan SWD, that's spotted wing Drosophila trap, comes pre-made. It's got the nice red mesh in there. It's easy to see, and it attracts the flies that you're trying to catch really easily. And then on the left with this little green hut, that's a slug trap, and it provides some aesthetics to the garden because once the slugs get in there, you don't see them as much from the outside looking down. However, you can make homemade traps that are almost as or more effective than the commercial ones. So this is a beer trap again on the left, but you can do that with a bread slurry. And then on the right, this is like a take-home soup container that somebody drilled holes in and filled with apple cider vinegar and put a little yellow card in there. And it serves the same function as that commercial trap we just looked at. So either way can be very effective. So that kind of brings us back to monitoring the garden, right? So for SWD, or spotted wing Drosophila, we'll use them as an example. We've put out our traps and we've caught flies in the trap, and our fruit, in this case strawberries, are to an overripe stage. We probably want to be spraying for spotted wing Drosophila. And that comes with some background knowledge, right? The spotted wing Drosophila has a serrated ovipositor, so it has a saw that can actually bore into fruit and lay its eggs. But it does that when fruit are ripe and overripe. So if you're spraying for SWD when you still got green strawberries, you may not be as effective as you would be spraying at the optimal time. Okay, looking at codling moth in apples and pears. If you're catching moths in your traps and apples and pears aren't petal fall, then it's probably time to spray for codling moth. And what does codling moth look like? So codling moth and a lot of other species may be caught in these pheromone sticky traps. So you'll want to be really comfortable with that ID. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here soon. Okay, next. We talked about monitoring. Next, let's talk about being confident in identifying our pests. Learn how to identify those pests and diseases. So normally this is where I ask the question, what pest is this? And then I get a lot of answers, and then I break it to folks that this is actually a ladybug and not a pest. But it's the point of being really confident in identifying what we're looking at, because we wouldn't want to spray for this. First things first, we want to make sure what we're looking at is a pest, especially when we're talking about plants. There can be a lot of symptoms that aren't necessarily pest related, right? And oftentimes that comes back to a nutrition deficiency. So we want to be familiar with, what does an iron deficiency look like? What does a nitrogen deficiency look like? What happens if we're low in phosphorus or low in magnesium? And just get an idea of what all of that means before we go out and start treating for something that isn't going to be fixed with a integrated pest management strategy. There's also a lot of abiotic issues that we run into the field that may look like biotic issues, but they're not. So on the left here, we have an apple that's bitter pit that we're seeing there. So it looks like it's pockmarked. There's brown marks on the inside too. And that's just a calcium deficiency. So that can be fixed next year with a lime application. And on the right here, sorry guys, if you can hear my cat. On the right here, we have a tomato that's got blossom end rot. And once again, we're looking at a calcium deficiency with an asterisk on it. Not bitter pit, blossom end rot is actually caused by a calcium uptake issue related to over and under watering of your tomatoes. So it's not necessarily that you have a calcium deficiency in the soil. It's more about the irrigation practices being used. Okay, next let's talk about biotic issues. So here we have some pictures of galls. These happen on plants, typically as swelling, either on the roots, on the shoots, sometimes even on the stalk or petiole of a plant. These are really typically associated with bacteria, but they can be viruses. Rarely they can be fungi. This is a really kind of key mark to say, okay, I've got a gall on this plant that leads me in a certain direction when trying to identify the issue. With rots, it's the same thing, right? So here we've got early blight on tomatoes. That's a really characteristic issue, that kind of wilted and blackening leaf. Botrytis on grapes, sometimes it's called noble rot. Also, sometimes it's called gray rot. And then mummyberry on blueberries. So this is oftentimes, if not always, a fungal issue. And the way that a particular plant or its fruit rots can actually be really key in diagnosing that particular issue, right? We also have insects, right? So there's different kinds of insect damage that we can see. Chewing insects are really common in Oregon. So strawberry root weevil shows that kind of scissor pattern. Remember, I talked about weevils kind of look like they scissor out parts of the leaves. Cabbage worm damage, they leave those holes in there. Kind of looks like it's been shot almost. And then earwigs kind of leave a lace behind. These can all be really key in diagnosing what particular issue you have. We also have sucking insects around here. So thrips, spider mites, and aphids. There's that kind of characteristic leaf curl that we see with too many aphids. And these two kind of really small polka dots or speckled leaves can be indicative of thrips or spider mites. Okay, let's talk a little bit about key pests or insects, right? So invasive species are obviously a pretty big issue in Oregon. We see more and more of them every year. And so we want to be familiar with the issues that we're facing and the symptoms that they leave behind. This one's pretty common. Unfortunately, it may not only be in your garden, it might also be in your house. Brown marmorated stink bug. They tend to predate on a lot of different plant species, including peppers. This is a picture of a pepper that's been pockmarked by brown marmorated stink bug. But they also affect hazelnuts. They can affect blueberries. They can get into wine grapes. They're a pretty big issue. And we want to be confident in identifying them because there's actually quite a few different species of stink bugs in Oregon, some that are native even. So you want to make sure that you're finding the issue and making sure it's the right species before you spray for it. Another issue we have a lot here is plant disease. So this is powdery mildew on wine grapes. This can be a really prolific issue, not only on wine grapes, but on squash and other cucurbits too. And some species of powdery mildew are resistant to different kinds of fungicides, right? So you want to be careful when choosing something to treat for this particular issue, that you're not just wasting money by spraying the wrong thing that won't affect it. Next, let's talk about thresholds. So what is your threshold to spray or treat for? In this case, on that picture on the right with aphids, that's beyond my threshold personally, but it may not be beyond yours. So that really depends. The threshold is determined by the grower's tolerance. Is it worth it to spray or treat? And your tolerance may vary depending on the plant, right? So for example, with aphids on hazelnuts, you can let a lot of aphids get on the leaves before it becomes a real big issue. They can actually turn black on the underside before you might spray for them. We're going back to hops in hop production. If we see 2 or 3 aphids, we're probably spraying for them. So there's a very big difference in the threshold or tolerance between those two plants when talking about one species. So treatment thresholds. Once again, visual inspections would exceed the allowable injury at any location. So you've got more bugs than you prefer to have, and they're causing more injury than you'd like on a particular plant. Borders and problem areas should be sampled separately. So what I'm saying there is we should be looking at the borders of your farm or garden, and then issue areas that particularly have a lot of issues separately from the main farm. And then one thing to think about is that the cumulative pest capture will go up. So with a lot of insects specifically, the first generation tends to start out a little slower, and then that second generation can get really fast, really quick. And then the question is, where in this sort of line are you comfortable spraying, right? So, for example, with codling moth, commercially, we often spray when we start to see 5 or more specific moths in a trap, right? Because if you don't, A, there's more moths than we're finding in the trap, and they may likely be in the fruit, or B, when they start reproducing or we run into that second generation, there's going to be a lot more of them. So this is a question to take home and think about. Should you treat your lawn if it has non-noxious weeds? So at home, if you've got white clover in the yard, is that something that we should be spraying for? I'll let you think about that at home. Okay, next. We talked about monitoring, we talked about identification, and next we're going to talk about choosing the appropriate controls. So we want to choose an integrated approach to control when we have an issue, right? We want to manage using all of the available strategies to us. And there's several strategies: cultural, physical, or mechanical, biological, and chemical. And we want to do this in this order if we can. When thinking about a problem that we have in our homes, garden, or on the farm, we want to try to approach it with this tier list to make sure that we're A, being the most economically and environmentally stable as we can, and B, so that we're reducing our chance of hazard on the farm or garden. So let's talk about those different kinds of controls. We'll start with cultural because that's the first control we should be looking at. So when talking about cultural controls, the first thing we should think about is planting healthy stock. So if we start with a good foundation in our gardens, we have a lot more control over what happens in the future of those gardens. Another thing we can think about is selecting plants with resistance. A lot of folks like to grow peaches around here, and one of the issues we have is leaf curl in this area. So one of the things that we can do to reduce the incidence of leaf curl is plant a resistant variety of peach in the area. So there's one called Frost that a lot of folks choose because it has a lot of resistance to leaf curl. And then you end up treating for that a lot less frequently. Another thing is planting correctly. I have this master gardener here that I love dearly. He really likes to grow tomatoes. And in tomatoes, you can plant them pretty deep and they'll do very well. Well, he took the same ideology of tomatoes and planted apple trees that way. And after he buried his apple trees 2-3 feet deep, they didn't really take off very well. In fact, they died. And he learned that, there's different ways to plant specific organisms where they might function better. We also want to work on maintaining our gardens. So water deep and fertilize, but don't overdo it on fertilization because that can cause issues too. We try to water the soil, so we don't want to spray the foliage if we can avoid it. Humid, dark, and damp environments cause fungal pathogens. So if we can avoid watering directly on the leaves, we want to do that. Pruning for airflow is really important. So especially if you've got perennial crops, so if we're thinking blueberries, apples, cherries, something like that, you want to prune your tree or bush in a way that when it's fully leafed out, a bird could fly through it unimpeded. And that's kind of a visual I like to go by when I'm thinking about how I should prune things. And then, of course, if we've got specific plants in the farm or garden that have disease, it's usually better if they're very diseased to pull those and get rid of them. And then we also want to think about sanitizing our tools, right? Another thing we can do is crop rotation. So this is just a really basic example of crop rotation. So let's say you've got one raised bed that you're switching out every year. The first year you might do root and bulbs. The second year you might do fruit and seed. And the third year you might do leaf and stem. And the idea there is you're just changing families or growth patterns to reduce the buildup of pathogens that might occur in a monoculture, right? And if you're doing that, you're really increasing your chances of having to not treat. So that can be really beneficial. You can also intercrop and undersow. So this reduces space for weeds to come up and get in the way of your crops. I've got one farmer here that grows squash, and under each side of the squash, he's got a cilantro and a parsley. And the reason that he does that is by the time it's ready to harvest the cilantro and parsley, he's got 1 or 2 squash flowers going on each bush. So he's now effectively gotten 2 crops out of that row before his main crop, the squash, has really even started. And so not only is he reducing weed pressure by having 3 crops in there, he's tripling his space, so to say, for farmers markets. Here's an example of that. Another thing is sanitation. I talked a little bit about sanitizing your tools earlier, but we really want to think about sanitizing our growing space too. So this is weed mat, and then we've got strawberries here. You got to clean the weed mat too, or else you'll end up with soil contact with your fruit, and you can end up with this kind of thing where you have botrytis on your strawberries. Sanitize your tools too. This reduces disease incidence tremendously. We can also work on reducing pest habitat. So one of the things we like to think about here is if you're growing blueberries, for example, invasive English hawthorns are great habitat for spotted wing Drosophila. So you might want to pull those out if you're trying to reduce the sprays that you have to use for your blueberries. Physical controls, we're talking about preventing infestations through row covers, barriers, bait crops. So using or planting crops that you expect pests to go to, you reduce that incidence of pests on your main crops. You can also use bird netting or sound deterrent for avian issues. If you use bird netting, make sure to pick one that doesn't catch birds. That's not our goal there. We want small enough netting that it just deters them. You can use water to remove small infestations, remove diseased or infested material, and sometimes you can just pick off the bugs. That can be helpful. You can also use pest vacuums. Not that kind though. Use the one on the right. That is a real vacuum designed to vacuum up bugs. Mowing and pruning can also help reduce insect and disease pressure. So here's an example of a barrier. This is just a really thin plastic barrier. It helps reduce certain pests. This is another example, actually 2 examples. We have weed barrier here, that's the black material. And then you've got insect barriers as the white material. You can also just manually remove weeds if you need to. There's that hand picking. So who wants to pick that leaf? All right, quickly, we'll talk about biological controls. Biocontrols are using biological organisms to control pests, parasites, to control pests. This is often parasites, predators, pathogens, things like this. Now we're going to talk about the 3 main approaches to biocontrol: conservation, augmentation, and importation. So we're kind of going to start with conservation. And one of the ways I really like to think about that is we're conserving species in our gardens to bring in the natural predators or the natural biocontrols that we might expect to see in Oregon. And one of the best ways to do that is gardenscaping. Parking lots are not good habitat for beneficial insects. So we want to think about what not only our garden, but our surrounding area looks like and what we might be inviting to the field. So when we're preparing that garden, think about what's around that. What are we planting around that? And what can we do to increase beneficial habitat? And creating habitat for beneficials can be kind of tricky. One of the things I really urge folks is to not fall into the trap of chocolate box ecology. Just because it's super pretty does not necessarily mean that it's beneficial. And that's not to say that you can't have pretty flowers, because you certainly can. But think about planting some stuff specific to bring in those beneficials. And some of those plants can be really pretty too. So we want to consider the timing of available nectar and pollen from plants, and does it line up with when our pests and our biocontrols will be present? And think about those predators. Are they present when your pest is? And oftentimes we can think about looking for insectiary plants. You might recognize in this, I've got dill down there. So that has a dual benefit. It's an insectiary plant, meaning that it is an area for biocontrols to propagate. And then also you can eat it. So that's pretty cool. Here's some examples of plants and what they bring in. So tick seed can bring in lacewings. Yarrow can bring in ladybugs. And pincushion flowers can invite hoverflies to your yard. So this is just sort of to highlight that just because we don't fall into chocolate box ecology doesn't mean that we can't have pretty gardens. And everyone's favorite slide. What about the little guys? So spiders and beetles are beneficial too. A lot of them actually do serve quite a good purpose. So we want to think about creating ground covers. That's one of my favorite ground covers there. That's Kinnikinnick. And it creates this great little habitat for our spiders and our beetles and other ground insects and arachnids to live in. Mulch and live plants can both give beneficial insects some protection. They also need water. So if you're using overhead irrigation already, you're likely good to go. You're probably providing enough water for your beneficials. If not, you can split water on or near your plants in the morning. We want to also think about reducing disease incidence, so we don't always want to water on the plants. Oftentimes, if you put a fountain or other sources of moving water in the garden, that can be a really good option. We just don't want to leave stagnant pools of water in the garden because that's when we start inviting things like mosquitoes. Okay, we talked about conservation. Let's talk a little bit about augmentation. This is supplemental biocontrol, mass production of a control species, usually repeated use of that species, and it's often used to target slow-moving species like mites. So oftentimes we're using bacteria, fungi, viruses, nematodes, parasites, or predators for this. Some folks may have bought nematodes at the store. That's a really common augmentative practice. Here's some examples of augmentative pesticides. So if you've ever sprayed BT before for Lepidoptera at home, or if you've ever used Sidex for codling moth, then you've used an augmentative pesticide. This is just a good example of augmentation. The two-spotted spider mite, making a callback to the beginning of this presentation, serious pest in the Pacific Northwest. We introduced a species of mites that actually predate on two-spotted spider mites. And they found that this particular species can overwinter in Oregon. So it turned out to be a pretty good control for two-spotted spider mites. And in some areas where they're not spraying as much, this species is still doing very well and predating on spider mites. So once again, that's mass production of the treatment species. So for example, you've got an issue with aphids in your garden this year, so you go and buy 10,000 ladybugs. You've mass produced that treatment species. Oftentimes these are pest specific, not always, but sometimes. What we need are more predators than prey. So we have to have more of the biocontrol than we have of the problem. These tend to be boom and bust cycles. So when the prey species runs out, the predators can either die off or they leave. These are meant to have an acute effect. So you've got a problem now, you're treating it now. And these are more effective when pest densities are lower, right? So they can easily be overpowered if there's too many of the prey species. Next, we're going to talk about importation. This is called classical biological control. So classical biological control is the importation of natural enemies for release and permanent establishment in a new region. If anyone's ever seen a cinnabar moth, then you're familiar with this. Sometimes it's best to bring the predator to the pest. So how this works is the pest's country of origin is determined, which is trickier than it sounds. Then the natural enemy of that pest is determined. We bring that over and put it in quarantine, and we study them to determine the effectiveness and other species targeted by that particular pest. And then a permit is obtained, and once that is obtained, we start breeding it. This is an example of that. This is the filbert aphid wasp, introduced in Oregon by OSU, go Beavs, in the 1980s. And it's helped keep the economic threshold for aphids really high, right? So these guys do a really good job of predating on aphids in hazelnut species. Remember earlier how I said if aphids are on hazelnuts, it takes a lot to get us to actually spray? And the reason for that is this particular wasp usually does a good enough job at keeping the populations under control where we don't have to spray, for aphids specifically. So once again, with that, as using that wasp as an example, they determined the predator of the aphid. They brought it over and raised it in an insectiary, and they raised them with the idea of long-term control or suppression of a specific pest. Once again, these have boom and bust cycles, especially with these that are very pest specific. If there's not enough prey species around, the predators will die off or leave. And once again, we always test these to make sure that they only feed on the intended species. The goal is not to introduce a new pest. Typically, these require multiple releases over several growing seasons. Right now, I'm doing a project where we're releasing biocontrol wasps in Douglas County. The idea is that we'll be doing that for the next 5 to 10 years, and we're releasing about 10,000 of those wasps a year. So they require population buildup. Oftentimes, they're intolerant to insecticides. They're also intolerant to inclement weather, so wind, heavy rains, and other environmental factors. So when thinking about the release of these species, we want to think about releasing them in areas where it's not sprayed if we can avoid it, and on nice weather days. So should you import bugs to your garden? It depends. Long-term populations have needs, so oftentimes it's not very effective to try to do a classic biological control in your own garden. And even if you're doing that or trying to do conservation, we need to be thinking about habitat, what prey population you have, and having a space that's not treated with pesticides. Okay, last, we're going to talk about chemical controls. One thing that I will really harp on here, the label is the law. So always read the label before you apply. Remember, that is a legally binding document. And if you need help reading a label, we have a publication. Choose the appropriate chemical for the pest. P&W Handbook has a lot of recommendations on that. Or you can talk to me or one of your local extension agents before you use a chemical. There's a lot of different types of pesticides. This is just a list showing you. And remember that side means kills. So all these pesticides are poisons. If they weren't, they wouldn't be pesticides. They wouldn't be effective, right? So choosing a pesticide means looking at the level of risk and judging that level of risk against the need for treating. There's a few different kinds of pesticides out there. RTUs, or ready to use, are pesticides that are pre-mixed and packaged in containers that usually double as applicators. These tend to have fewer steps. You don't have to measure and mix them, and there's less chance of mistakes. Concentrates come in larger containers usually, and they're measured and mixed by the user. And this typically tends to be better if you're using them on larger areas. Here's some pesticide terminology you might run into: commercial and home use, hard and soft. That talks about effectiveness or how it might affect non-target species. Organic and synthetic, broad and narrow spectrum or selective and non-selective. Short-term residual, how long that pesticide stays around. Contact or systemic. Curative or protectant. Pre-emergent or post-emergent. There's also modes of action that we want to be paying attention to in pesticide use. So contact is when a pesticide must be sprayed directly on a target. Systemic is when pesticides go through that plant and are translocated through to either protect it or to kill it. And then residual is the pesticide will persist after application, offering control for a period of time. Pre-emergence versus post-emergence. Pre-emergence are what you use before a weed shows up. You're trying to treat before seedling emergence. Post-emergent would be something that you would use on weeds or plants after they have already sprouted. Curative versus protectant. Curatives correct an existing product or problem, and they can kill target pests when they're present. That doesn't mean they have walk back. It doesn't fix the damage that's already done. It just kills that particular pest. And then protectants are usually used beforehand to try to prevent that problem from occurring. Organics versus synthetics. Organics are derived from an organic source. They usually biodegrade rapidly, which means they don't have a lot of residual activity, and they have varying levels of toxicity associated with them. I want to point out, just because it says organic doesn't mean it's safe. And then synthetics are typically manufactured via chemical reactions and tend to persist in the environment longer. They have a longer residual activity. Broad spectrums, we've talked about these a lot. They kill a wide range of pests and beneficials. There's a list of some of them that we've talked about earlier today. And then we have narrow spectrum pesticides. This is that current to progressive future. So these tend to only affect one genera or one species when we're treating with them. Once again, organic does not necessarily mean safe. Rotenone is organic pesticide. We used it in Diamond Lake in Douglas County a few years ago to kill all of the fish in the lake to try to get rid of an invasive chub. This used to be a pesticide that got banned down to the use to kill fish only now because they realized how toxic it is. So pesticide hazards. Some pesticides are really toxic. What is the risk involved with using them? Well, risk is toxicity and exposure, right? So zero exposure means zero risk. High toxicity pesticides and good management means low risk. Low toxicity pesticides and poor management means a high risk hazard. So one thing we want to think about when using pesticides is how are we managing for the risk associated with that particular chemical? This is just how toxicity is determined through an LD50. Here's some examples of LD50s. Table salt down to nicotine. And in the middle there, we have diazinon, imidacloprid, and carbaryl. Those are all three common pesticides. This just shows what that might actually mean for a 175-pound person. All right, let's talk about minimizing the negative effects of pesticides. When we can, we want to choose narrow over broad spectrum insecticides. You can spot treat rather than broadcast. Always read the label and follow those directions. Remember, that's a legally binding document. Wear protective clothing and eyewear. Use your PPEs. Dispose of unwanted pesticides in empty containers properly. Usually that means triple washing empty containers or taking unwanted pesticides to a collection event. And use the appropriate timing when spraying. For example, if you're using Rex Lime Sulfur at the wrong time of year, you may end up killing a plant or you may end up stripping it of its fruit. So, and that's not the intended effect usually. There's those mating disruptors we talked about. This is a different solution, right? So we don't necessarily have to use a pesticide if we can use something like this. Disrupts those mating signals, releases that pheromone, and it usually works better in larger areas. So when should you spray? After identifying the pest, identifying the threshold, and making sure the timing of the chemical lines up with the life stage of the pest. Over here, I've got a couple scales. They don't do well, or they do really well against pesticides, I should say, when they're in this life stage. That protective barrier they have over them in this picture will deter most pesticides. They'll live through most sprays. On the other hand, if you spray them when they look like this, when the mother has deteriorated and you're looking at the larval stage, then you have a really good chance of getting rid of those scales. So the main thing I'm just pointing out there is think about the timing of application. All right. So before we use pesticides, we want to think about those IPM steps. Scout, identify, establish your threshold, evaluate your management steps, and then manage using all available strategies: cultural, physical, biological, and chemical, in that order. All right, and with that, thank you, everybody. These are my two favorite pests. That's Otis on the left and Millie on the right. They're my dogs at home.
Well, whoop. Thank you very much. You spoke so quickly, Logan. You were clearly had a lot to get through, and you did the timing perfectly. So I appreciate that. We have just a few questions here. One of them is, what is your sense of the use of pesticides across all agriculture? Which vegetables, grain, fruits use more pesticide compared to usage in the past, and which ones have decreased usage?
Ooh, that is
That's
a
a
good question.
biggie.
Yeah, I would say that the way things are headed now, most folks or most commercial cropping systems are using less pesticides overall, especially because I don't know if I've worked with anyone who's on a time spray anymore. The main thing we do is threshold scouting and then threshold spraying. So we find a pest, we find enough of them, then we treat for it. It's just not
That's very,
economically viable otherwise.
yeah. And that would be true across the United States. That's not just an Oregon thing or Pacific Northwest.
It's certainly a Pacific Northwest thing. In the Midwest, there may still be some time sprays, but I haven't worked with anyone that does that.
And the next question is, can you talk about some examples of bait crops? You use
Sure.
that term.
Yeah. So for example, if you're growing vegetable crops, you may plant kale or chard in the background. And with the idea of that being is you're going to lose that on purpose. I actually do that at home. I don't like chard very much. So I plant it around my garden. And then all of the leaf miners go into the chard and they leave my broccoli alone. And I'm very happy with that.
You are both happy, right? You and the
That's
leaf
right.
miners.
That's right. Everybody's happy.
And the last question, and this is one, well, it's really more of a statement. This is for me. I would have said before this presentation that I was a pesticide-free gardener. But then as you're talking, I realize I use slug bait and I use mosquito dunks.
Mm-hmm.
So those are both pesticides, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Well, now I know. And here's another, what resources do you recommend to correctly identify the pests in my garden?
Yeah, absolutely. So one I use a lot is the Pacific Northwest Handbook. Solve pest problems can also be really helpful for that. If you're looking at weeds, Weeds of the West can be a really helpful guide. And then also definitely check out your plant clinics. Do you guys have an insect ID committee up there?
Well, we have a plant clinic. If we have an insect ID clinic I think it's in Corvallis, if somebody brings in an actual example of the insect. But I
Perfect.
work on the helpline, and and we answer plant ID questions and insect ID questions all the time. And what we require, and I will just say this for everybody who's listening in, we need good pictures.
Mhm.
We need, if it's an insect, we need something that shows the size, and we need a good clear picture. Perfect would be ventral and dorsal sides. If it's a plant, what we need is a picture of the plant in its growing space, where it's growing, a picture of where it is in the ground so we can see how it was planted, and then a picture of, if it's got a problem, the front and back of the leaf or the problem. And so often people call into us and say, or send us an email and say, I've got this problem with my plant's leaves are turning brown. There's nothing we can do with that information. We need the specifics before we can really pin anything down.
Absolutely.
So that's everything we've got. And this has been very, very informative, Logan, and I really appreciate it. And we may be talking again. Thanks
Awesome.
so much.
Yeah. Thank you guys.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
And if everybody else would stay on, we've got our chapter meeting coming up next.